As Teachers Education College, the institution was integrated as a part of Pajajaran University, then amended into Institute of Teacher Education and Educational Sciences, or IKIP, and finally re-established as Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, or UPI. The Bumi Siliwangi building, formerly known as Villa Isola, is the university's main building as well as its icon. Villa Isola, an Art Deco building that currently serves as the Rectorate building, is now inaugurated as one of the nation's cultural heritage buildings. UPI's primary mission is to become a leading and outstanding university. Thereby, UPI is committed to promote academic excellence and nurture innovation and scholarly development in order to be a leading pioneer in the field of education. By having scientific, educative, and religious as its motto, UPI strives to balance the three concepts, all in one harmony. Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia is made up of 8 faculties: Faculty of Educational Sciences, Faculty of Social Science Education, Faculty of Language and Literature Education, Faculty of Mathematics and Science Education, Faculty of Technology and Vocational Education, Faculty of Sports and Health Science Education, Faculty of Economics and Business Education, Faculty of Art and Design Education, and UPI also offers postgraduate programs at the School of Postgraduate, including various research opportunities and civic services at the Center of Research and Community Services. Additionally, UPI also offers non-educational courses as a mandate extension of the government to nurture future graduates of non-educational programs. UPI, in its academic implementation, is committed to apply cross-fertilization approach between educational and non-educational programs to mutually strengthen both of the areas. A part of the main campus in Bandung, UPI is strengthened by 6 branch campuses, which located in several locations.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? The International Distinguished Scholar Webinar Series, World-Class University, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia is about to begin. I would like everybody to be reminded to keep their microphone off. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good morning from Bandung, the city of flowers, Indonesia. And also a very good afternoon and good evening from whichever sides of the world you currently are. I hope everybody stays safe and healthy amidst the global pandemic of COVID-19. My name is Syabubad Abdullah, and I am delighted to be hosting today's event. The Honorable Vice Rector for Research, International Affairs, Business and Partnership, Professor Dr. Adang Suherman, MA. The Honorable Director of the Directorate of International Affairs, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, Bapak Ahmad Bukhari Muslim, PhD. The Honorable Speaker, Professor Peter Fleming from University Technology of Sydney Business School. The Honorable Moderator, Ibu Vina Adriani, PhD. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, warmest greetings and welcome to the 5th International Distinguished Scholar Webinar Series, World-Class University, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia. This event, which is the 5th out of 7 other webinar series, is organized by the Directorate of International Affairs, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, as a part of commemoration of Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia's 67th anniversary, or Dies Natalis. Today's topic of discussion will be about Dark Academia, Who's Afraid of the Neoliberal University, delivered by our distinguished speaker, Professor Peter Fleming from University Technology of Sydney Business School, who is also an author of Dark Academia, How Universities Die. To begin with, I would like to invite the Director of Directorate of International Affairs, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, Bapak Ahmad Bukhari Muslim, PhD, to deliver his report. Bapak Ahmad Bukhari, please.
Thank you, Pak Ubad, the MC. Good morning to audience in Indonesia and ASEAN countries. Good early morning to those participants in the United Kingdom and other Asian and African countries. Good afternoon to Professor Peter Fleming in Sydney, Australia, and also good evening to those audience in the United States and other parts of the world. Honorable Professor Adangsu Herman, the Vice Director of Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia for Research, International Partnership and Business. Honorable Speaker, Professor Peter Fleming, University Technology of Sydney, UTS Business School, Australia. Honorable Moderator, Dr. Fina Adriani from Department of Early Child Education, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia. And dear all audience from Indonesia and overseas countries. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Again, it is with great pleasure to welcome you all virtually to the International Distinguished Call Webinar Series 5. This webinar series is organized by Directorate of International Affairs in commemoration with UPI's 67th anniversary or Dies Natalis, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia. Kindly be advised that we have 7 webinar series altogether starting October until the end of November 2021. So we have 2 more webinar series left next week. The topic of today's webinar series is Dark Academia, Who is Afraid of Neoliberal University by Professor Peter Fleming from University Technology of Sydney, UTS Business School in Australia. Professor Peter Fleming is also the author of a very well-known and recently released book titled Dark Academia, How Universities Die. Ladies and gentlemen, the impact of neoliberalism has been pervasive in our life. Not only does it include economy, but also education. In complying with this issue, higher education institution is geared toward economy and commodifications. As some scholars have pointed out, due to neoliberalism, higher education institution has shifted from its symbolic into instrumentalized disciplinary knowledge, favoring its economic functions. Such educational inequality, economic orientations, and tension between economic development and commitment to the public good as a fundamental principle of education may also be identifiable in many universities across the globe, including at Indonesian higher education institutions. Considering the importance of understanding this issue of neoliberalism and how it may also contribute to the provision of quality and equitable education as stipulated by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which our speaker will discuss further, it is no wonder that this webinar has received a significant reception from audience of scholars, researchers, lecturers, and students in Indonesia and, of course, overseas. At the moment, we, the organizing committee, have received about 500 registration of participants coming from across Indonesia and overseas countries, such as Brunei Darussalam, China, Malaysia, Philippines, Ghana, India, the United Kingdom, and the United States. This event is aired by Zoom and TV UP live streaming. Ladies and gentlemen, the organization of this International Distinguished Call Webinar Series will not be possible without strong support and resilience of people who have worked very hard behind the scene. They are staff members of Directorate of International Affairs, Information and Technology System, and Public Relations of Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, who really deserve a big and round applause. Finally, I would like to invite Professor Adang Suherman, the Vice Rector for Research, International Partnership and Business, to officially open this webinar today. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, I wish you a reflective and insightful webinar. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Bapak Ahmad Bukhari Muslim PhD, the Director of the Directorate of International Affairs, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, for the report. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to call upon the Vice Rector of Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia for Research, International Affairs, Partnership and Business, Professor Adang Suherman, to deliver his welcoming speech as well as to officially open today's agenda. Professor Adang Suherman, the floor is now yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, sir.
Okay. Honorable Rector and Vice Rectors of Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, Honorable Speaker, Professor Peter Fleming from University Technology of Sydney, Business School, Australia, Honorable Moderator Vina Adriani from Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, dear all ladies and gentlemen from Indonesia and overseas countries, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I am extremely honored to say a few words as the opening of this international webinar series 5. As you may have been informed, this webinar series is organized by Directorate of International Affairs as part of 67 UPI anniversary or Dies Natalis. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in an era of neoliberalism where education is often reduced upon merely economic activities. While economy does play an important role in humans' life, but one should not forget the real responsibilities of higher education in the society. For us, this webinar is really important since Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia has claimed itself as the only university in Indonesia that still have its emphasis on education. Hence, this webinar should serve as an invitation for us to reflect and rethink on the meaning of education. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that while our university is trying its best to be part of the word university, but the term word university should serve as a means rather than an end itself, meaning the term word university should serve as an encouragement for us to play more critical roles in the global world. I believe that in this webinar from Professor Fleming will open up more discussion and how we can negotiate our role and responsibilities as academic and scholar in the pervasiveness of the neoliberalism pressure. Finally, as requested by the organizing committee, I would now officially declare this webinar series open by saying Basmalah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I wish you a fruitful and insightful webinar. Thank you very much, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Professor Adan Suherman, Vice Rector for Research, International Affairs, Partnership and Business, for delivering such a warm welcoming speech and for officially opening today's agenda. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, now that the event has just been officially opened, it's time for us to listen to the talk on dark academia, who's afraid of the neoliberal university. But first, allow me to deliver a set of reminders as follows. Number one, I would like to remind you of the attendance through the link distributed on either on the comment section, either on the chat room on the Zoom for those who are participating in the Zoom link, or on the comment section of the YouTube live stream at TVUP YouTube channel. And also later on the discussion session, you could drop the questions at slido.com. Those who joined the previous webinars have been familiar with it, but I would like to remind the newbies of today's webinar. You can go to slido.com or you can scan the QR code and drop your question there. And later the moderator will pick the most voted questions at the Q&A session. And don't forget to enter the code hashtag #TopWebinar5. And don't forget to state your full name and your affiliations on your question. I would like to remind you that the hashtag is case sensitive, so don't forget to write the TOP and W in capital letters and EBINAR in small capital letters, and the 5 is in number. So ladies and gentlemen, and also in addition to the Zoom meetings, we are also live streaming today's webinar through TVUP YouTube channel, or you can also scan the QR code on the display. Ladies and gentlemen, this session will be chaired by our distinguished moderator, Ibu Vina Adriani. But first, allow me to introduce her to you. Vina Adriani is a head for Center of Gender and Childhood Studies. She is also an associate professor at the Department of Early Childhood Education, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia. Her research focused on the issue of gender in earlier settings and the impact of neoliberalism to early childhood education. She also has published a number of peer-reviewed articles, some of which are Neuroscience and the Construction of a New Child in Early Childhood Education in Indonesia, a Neoliberal Legacy, and also doing feminist participatory action research for disrupting traditional gender discourses with Indonesian Muslim kindergarten teachers. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in giving the warmest welcome to our moderator today, whom I'm so lucky to call my dearest colleague, Ibu Vina Adriani, PhD.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening for those of you who are in another part of the globe, and good evening for Professor Peter Fleming. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I would like to thank Pak Ubad for a very warm introduction, and I would like to welcome you all to the fifth event of the International Distinguished Scholar Webinar Series hosted by Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia in Bandung, Indonesia. It is truly an honor for me to be able to moderate the lecture from Professor Fleming, whose work have been very influential and initiate further discussion about the impact of neoliberalism in higher education and what kind of roles higher education should play in this massive era of neoliberalism. I have to inform Professor Fleming that for the past couple of months, many academics in Indonesia have discussed your works, and I think we are all very fortunate today to be able to discuss the topic directly with you. So before we proceed, please allow me to briefly mention his curriculum vitae, though I believe Professor Fleming needs no introduction. So Professor Peter Fleming is a professor at University of Technology Sydney Business School and has previously held position at Cambridge University, Queen Mary University of London, and Chess Business School. Peter research has focused on the future work and the serious ethical implication it raises. He is the author of several books, including The Mythology of Work, published by Pluto Press, Sugar Daddy Capitalism, published by Polity Book, and then of course one of the most recent one, and I think the most discussed one in our country, is the Dark Academia: How Universities Die. Professor Fleming has also published a number of article. I have to say, I think it's more than 60 peer-reviewed article, and his latest article, if I'm not mistaken, is entitled "Not Even Trying to Change the World: Why Do Elite Management Journals Ignore the Major Problems Facing Humanity?" published in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science. So I think without further delay, everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Fleming, and his talk today will be on Dark Academia, Who's Afraid of the Neoliberal University. So Professor Fleming, please.
Thank you very, very much, Vina, and it's been a pleasure working with you to organize this talk. Thank you very much for everything that you've, all of your support for allowing me to be here today. It's an absolute delight to be able to speak at your esteemed Universitat. I would just like to thank the Rector for those opening words, and also the International Office, the Director, and the staff for inviting me to this very esteemed event. It's a real pleasure to be here to speak and to deliver this webinar. The topic is on the university, and I'll talk a little bit about what I'm trying to achieve with the recent book. It's been out for about 3 or 4 months, I think, maybe a little bit longer. And so what I plan to do is unpack the basic message in the book, and we can discuss some of the points therein. Can you hear me okay? Yep. Fantastic, fantastic. Well, am I able to share my screen, Vina? I have oh, great. I have a slide. I have some slides, rather than just watching me, some slides just with some information about the argument and some of the things I've discovered. So I will share that. There we go. Is that okay?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. So Dark Academia, Who's Afraid of the Neoliberal University? I would just like to talk a little bit about how this project came about first. You know, I'm a big fan of the university and I love being an academic, and I've been very fortunate to have worked in some fantastic universities with some wonderful staff. And I hadn't really written about the university. I've written, you know, numerous books on work. I've looked at, you know, the gig economy, the corporation, and so forth, but I hadn't really looked at the university during my career until I started this project. And I began to look into the university. And even though in the back of my mind, I knew that major changes were unfolding and I had experienced those changes, I couldn't really make sense of what was going on until I began to research the neoliberal university. Neoliberalism, of course, a United States invention coming from the Chicago School of Economics, a bit of Austrian economics there as well, but the neoliberal university meaning a university, especially a public one, that basically pretends that it's a private organization and organizes its affairs along those lines. So why is that a problem? Where does the dark academia come from? Well, some of the things I began to uncover when researching this project a year or two ago, before I even began to write the book, was actually quite frightening. It seemed to me that the public perception of what it meant to be an academic and to go to university as a student and to work within the university, let's call it the ivory tower version of what a university meant, was very different to the emerging story that I was beginning to uncover, which was a little bit more grimmer, darker, in the sense of not being the wonderful, joyous house of learning that we expect the university to be. So that's what really motivated me to begin on this project and to write about dark academia. That is the unspoken, behind the scenes story of what it's like to be in a so-called neoliberal university. I will talk about what I mean by the neoliberal university soon, but I think that perhaps that concept neoliberal has some problems, and I'm trying to think ahead of what an alternative concept may be to be capturing what I'm talking about in this book. So once again, thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here. I hope this doesn't get you too depressed, because some of the issues that I discuss in the book are very kind of morose. So I just warn you in advance. And I guess it's a warning. It's a warning. Neoliberalism is spreading around the world, and it's, markets, commercialization, and so forth. And there is a side to it that is very negative. And when that meets higher education, the book that I've written is trying to uncover what actually occurs there, behind the brochures, behind the official narrative that we have of higher education today. So this is the book. This is not a plug, by the way. So I just want to let you know that there is a book there, and this is the one that I wrote as a way for me, to figure out what was going on. I think that most writers and researchers, when we write about things, I choose a topic that I know nothing about, rather than the other way around. I know everything about the neoliberal university, so let's write a book on it. I knew nothing about the neoliberal university, and that's always a motivator for me to get researching and to get into the data and into the scholarly analysis of what's going on to figure out what is happening. And being an academic, it's very close to home, of course. And one of the reasons why I hadn't really explored the university in the past is that, there's this kind of sense of, you don't want to be moaning about what is widely perceived to be a privileged job, a privileged occupation that is got great hours, and this is the public perception, is well paid and so forth. You don't want to be seen as whinging about what you do. But once I got into some of the stories that are out there, I was really shocked. And I guess the purpose of the book is to bring to a wider public what's happening in universities today, and also to provide a framework for us as academics to explain what's happening in our occupation too. However, I'm not an enemy of the university. I'm a big fan of the university, but I think that it's gone wayward. It's taken the wrong path in the Western world in particular. I'm talking about my experiences in the UK, the United States, parts of Europe, and so forth. And this is a plea, I guess, to change course, given what I've discovered. So I'll talk about what exactly that is. The first thing that I want to let you know about this book and about what happened is that I actually finished it before COVID-19 hit. The global pandemic, I'd actually finished the manuscript in late 2019. And and send it to the publisher, and then bang, you know, the whole world was turned upside down. All campuses had to close, and we've all experienced a huge disruption that occurred because of the pandemic. And I thought to myself, wow, right, okay, I hadn't mentioned the pandemic. I thought to myself, wow, this book is out of date even before it's been published. And I actually laughed. I thought that's quite ironic, you know. So I've been working on this for 1.5 years and it's out of date and it hasn't even been published. And I talked to the publisher, and the publisher says, look, you know, how much would be needed to, you know, you're not going to rewrite it, of course, but, you know, can you bring it up to date with what's happening in the world today, since it's had such a huge impact, very negative impact on universities, higher education around the world. And I was actually quite surprised by how little I had to change. And that's surprising, because I would have thought that I would have had to kind of really rewrite the basic narrative. But what I think has happened is that the pandemic has brought out kind of cracks and problems and tensions that were already there for many, many years. They've just been brought to the surface. And we can see this in the way in which the crisis has been used, for example, in the UK, to really embed and entrench the neoliberal university. So rather than starting again and trying a different model, it's been used to kind of even solidify and extend neoliberalization in the UK higher education system, and in other countries as well, including the US and so forth. So, you know, what do I mean by the neoliberal university? I think that higher education over the last 30 years, from the countries that I've explored, and I explored them in the book, the UK, parts of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Australasia, the US, of course, and, you know, it could be the case in Indonesia as well. But we can talk about that. I'm less familiar with higher education in your country, but it seems that, you know, the university has been commercialized, financialized, corporatized, almost beyond recognition within a 30-year period. And that's been done in the name of transparency. It's been done in the name of taxpayers' value for money. It's been done in the name of accountability in public universities. But what I think we're seeing now, and the pandemic's just amplified these trends, are what I call the dark undercurrents. And undercurrents in the sense that they're under the surface. You don't see them in the glossy brochures of universities, but under the surface, some very dark and troubling trends that this book has tried to explain and to figure out, you know, where we might want to go from here. So creating the corporate university, so where did it come from? So where's the neoliberal university? You know, where did it come from? What are its features and so forth? Well, first of all, just to give us a snapshot of what I'm talking about, I think the first thing that we need to realize is that it's a real product of governmentality. And this is interesting because you can't really blame, well, you can to a certain extent, but it's not simply upper management in a university doing all of this. You know, it's reflecting wider changes in society, the neoliberalization of government, politicians and think tanks and ministries being kind of obsessed, if you like, with the idea that markets and competition and commercialization are the best way forward in any sector, including higher education, which was one of the last of the state services to be commercialized in this way. They were kind of left to the end. But there's a government funding process, you know, drip feeding money, getting universities to compete with each other for funding for students and to be treated basically like a business. So there's a strong emphasis on mimicking the business world in this way. Now, that's not to say that the business world is problematic, but we're dealing with universities which are kind of a different beast compared to a corporation, for example. Academics, you know, have been trained to be collegial, to debate, to question, and to work off their own volition, to be very self-driven, to do what they do, not for the money, but for the joy of research. All of these qualities are quite foreign in many large business organizations. So there's a tension between this attempt to mimic the private corporation, which the university does quite badly. It doesn't quite get there because it's not really designed to be doing a corporate kind of project. There's a tension between the values of the traditional academic university and that mimicking of the business world. There is new public management, which is a philosophy of management that really is associated with neoliberalism. And this is about management power hierarchies and creating transparency, measuring everything, performance incentives, and so forth. So really kind of taking this management philosophy that you might expect in a factory, you might expect in a private organization, and applying it to very highly trained, independent knowledge workers, as we are in universities. And this is termed new public management, and has been written about quite a lot. Not only the university, hospitals, any public sector organization has been subjected, if you like, to new public management, and it has a lot of critics. Also, I think associated with this is neoclassical economics. I'm a kind of an amateur economist in the sense that I like to know where these ideas come from, and a lot of the neoliberal ideas come from economists. In particular, the Austrian school of libertarianism, Hayek, for example, the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman, and the immense influence that's had on the way in which our world has unfolded today, but also the employment relationship, which universities embraced with enthusiasm. The idea that, you know, we're no longer a community of peers as we were in, or an emporium or a collegium, to use an old-fashioned phrase, of peers, in which we decide on how the university or the organization is going to operate. We make decisions together because we're all very highly trained experts, to one that you have an employer and an employee, like in a factory. And the employer doesn't trust the employee because the employee has different interests. The employee wants to get as much money as possible and to not work that much or work as less as possible. The employer, of course, wants to get as much work out of the employee, and there's a tension in the relationship. They set up incentives, etc., etc. And this is how neoclassical economics basically sees the employment relationship. Principal agency theory, Jensen being a classic example of that. Competition among universities to compete for students, like corporations in an open market, which changes their internal structures, of course, but competition between academics to be the best, you know, to be stars, to get the best publications, to perform and meet all of their KPIs, their key performance indicators, and of course, transforming students into customers and competition to get those students through our door onto our seats, which of course has been very difficult with the pandemic. And that's really changed the face, I think, of what I call the corporate university or the neoliberal university. So what I'd like to do next is just to unpack some of what I think are the salient features that are happening here. And then I'll give you kind of my take on how we can kind of extend our understanding of what's occurring. So this section that I'm going to look at now is my summary of existing research. So what existing research has discovered when analyzing the neoliberal university. And then once we've done that, I'll give you my take, my insights, which I explore in the book, on what's happening, so that we can get a better idea, I think, of some of the problems that we have when analyzing the neoliberal university today. So first of all, and I've got 6 features that I think are really important for us when conceiving and conceptualizing the neoliberal university. The first one I think is quite important, and this is what I call the authoritarian turn. And what I mean by that is, relating back to that idea of the employer and the employee, and you have managers and they manage, and they may be nice managers, they may be not so nice managers, but there does seem to have been an authoritarian turn in the sense that the old idea of consultation, discussion, debate doesn't happen as much as it used to. And in fact, anything like dissent is stamped out, is stamped out. And I call this the authoritarian turn because it's based upon this idea of, well, now, it may have once been a collegium of peers in which a collegium of colleagues in which we all made the decisions that were going to impact on our organizations together. But no, not now. We have elite managers and they give out orders and you obey them. And if you don't obey them, well, you can leave, okay? And that's opened up a totally different atmosphere or culture, I think, in the universities that I've studied, in which it is like a corporation in the sense that if I don't, agree, or if I dissent with an opinion and so forth, then, then there's trouble ahead. But managerialization is an interesting thing in the university. One thing that's important to note is that, universities have always had authority. That's not new. And they've always had managers. That's not new. In fact, if you've got a large organization, then you need to have administrators. That goes back to classic organizational sociology. It's so we don't want to have this idea of the universities beforehand where these managerless, authorityless institutions, these utopias, because they weren't. However, I think what's happened is that higher education is relying on authority more than it has ever. And you've seen a proliferation of managers and managerialism within the university in order to get things done. Ironically, even to get things done that academics may have done without having the orders and the hierarchies and the bureaucracy. So an authoritarian turn is an important feature. Now, this is Professor Dougherty, and he become renowned in the UK when I was living in the UK. I lived in the UK for 15 years. He became renowned at the Warwick University. He is a professor in English for being suspended for sighing inappropriately in meetings. And he also had ironic remarks, and he was suspended. And it turned out he had to be restated because it was a unjustifiable disciplinary action. But it goes to show, even sighing inappropriately, or I think the phraseology was giving off negative vibes. And he was told by managers, get out, yep, you're suspended. And of course, there was a major campaign to reinstate him. He was found to be, unfairly treated. But it's a good indicator, a good barometer, if you like, of the intolerance to what used to be a normal way of organizing academic knowledge, in which we'd debate, we'd question, and so forth. The second feature I think is being talked about a lot when it comes to the neoliberal university is the bane of most academics you'll talk to around the world, and that's metrics. That what is a complex process, a labor process of making knowledge, which is qualitative, it's cooperation with colleagues, it takes time, you don't see results immediately. Teaching, in which the student may not understand that they've had a good education until several years later. right? They may find it unpleasant, and learning is unpleasant sometimes, but several years later, they may realize, oh, well, it was actually a good education. The tyranny of metrics is this measuring and getting this immediate numerical representation of what's going on within an organization. Now, universities are not alone. Many organizations and institutions have embraced metrics and have seen numbers are the only things that matter. But once again, you know, all organizations before neoliberalization had to have some sort of numerical representation. Cost accounting, management accounting have all been used, you know, for many, many, many years. But it's this, again, this excessive reliance, over-reliance on numerical representation and metrics to gain a representation of what's happening in a university, I think has led to a lot of problems. You know, metrics and numbers tell us only one part of the story. For example, it doesn't tell us about people working together behind the scenes. It doesn't tell us about that lag that I talked about. So student evaluation surveys, you know, to give you an immediate, you know, am I happy now? Rather than in 2 years' time, I realize that, well, that was a great class, you know. And it tells us only about what the numbers want to measure, rather than what's going on behind the scenes or on different dimensions within an institution. So I think the tyranny of metrics has been problematic. For example, I'll give you an example that I was told about. You know, if a university sends out a list of the top 10 teachers in the institution, and I talk about this in the book, the top 10 based upon presumably student feedback, you know, you got, you know, the top 10, and so everyone else feels depressed, right? Even number 11, yep. So number 11, who doesn't feature on the list, even they feel dejected. Well, you know, I was trying as well. And sometimes even those on the list feel dejected. Well, what about everyone that helped me do what I did, you know? So it individualizes, and it misses a large part of how an institution works. So the tyranny of metrics, rankings, journal rankings, citations, indexes, the H index, university national rankings, global rankings, I think are really problematic and have created this culture of, a very narrow culture, but a culture of anxiety. You know, where are we on the rankings? How are my citations going? Are they increasing? You know, getting on Google citation or Google Scholar. It's created this weird atmosphere, I think, that is problematic in universities. And of course, with big data, and I call this dashboarding, you know, that big data dashboard is kind of exemplary of this reliance on numbers to manage others. Now, the traditional reason why administrators and managers rely on numbers is that they're simple. You don't need to talk to anyone. You get the numbers, and then you manage accordingly. And I think that dashboards with the use of digital data, which is really taking off in higher education, as they have in other institutions, you know, where you can see, you know, I'm a bar graph. You know, 57%, you know, it's one representation of what's happening in the organization. But if you just relied upon these numbers for what was happening on the ground in reality, you'd have a misleading sense of what was going on. So I think this reliance on numbers, I think it's just been taken too far. It's been taken too far, and it has all of these perverse incentives now, unintended consequences of creating a culture that's dejected and disappointed, you know, and with academics focusing only on their citations rather than good research that interests them and that might make a positive difference to the world. And of course, this has ramped up stress. Yeah. So one of the big things that have been discussed in critical university studies is the stress and the pressure to perform, to get a good rating, to get a good journal article, to get a a top ranking publication. So in the UK, one survey showed that academics work around, on average, 50 hours a week, which is obviously, that's above what they're being paid for, to keep up on the treadmill. Never good enough, never good enough. Academics under 25 have work up to 100 hours a week because they're trying to prove themselves, get a good job, to get the top journal publication. So there's this culture of overwork that's really kind of swept through higher education. Now, remember how I opened this talk, going back to that image of the ivory tower, peaceful, relaxed, very slow professor, contemplating the issues in life. It just doesn't bear any resemblance to what's really going on in universities today, which was a big motivation for the book. The third issue that I think is important is what is called, and this is a US American term, adjunctification or casualization of the workforce. So no longer when you join a university, you would have regular permanent staff, but using casualized staff, on-demand contracts like are used in the gig economy. And this has created deep insecurity among the workforce. That's a really important feature of the neoliberal university today. Now, the reason employers use these types of employment relationships is that it's easy to fire people. It's flexibility for some, but not for everyone. And you hire them for what you need on demand, and then you get rid of them when you don't need them. So with the pandemic, of course, many staff were let go. But it does create a different culture within the institution. And I have always argued that adjunctification not only is bad for those on casualized contracts, but for everyone else as well, because that could be the way the whole institution may go. And so it creates a sense of insecurity and anxiety among everyone, which again is a power relationship. So adjunctification, I think, is, in some institutions, from my research in the UK, more than half of the academic staff were on part-time contracts. And that trend seems to be increasing, whereas 30 years ago, you joined a university, you had a permanent tenured position. Not the case today. In fact, getting rarer and rarer. And a lot of studies have been looking at the gig economy, the use of gig economy contracts, the adjunctification, the underclass, the adjunct underclass in the United States. This has really kind of been perfected in the United States colleges, where adjunctification has really taken off, but it's spread to other countries, of course, as well. And in the United States, some horror stories regarding what's happening in this regard. And this is probably one of the most depressing stories that I come across when looking at this. And it was written by a journalist in the United States for a university, about a university adjunct, Margaret Mary Voico, at a university in Pittsburgh, a Catholic university. And she was an adjunct. She was paid $25,000 a year. She taught French. She was a French instructor. She had, I think, 4 courses each semester, so very, very heavy workload. She was 83. She was 83 years old, and she was caught napping in the university and was fired. She had to go and work for a Park and Eat, which is a kind of a convenience store in the United States, and died. And she died of a major heart attack. And it was a huge scandal in the US regarding, okay, this is not what we expect academics to live like. They'd cut off her power in her house, really just hit really hard times, 83, had no family. And, the scandal was around how she had worked for the university for 25 years, as a casualized staff member. Very underpaid, minimum wage. The university president was on $700,000 US a year, which brought to light the injustices of the trend that adjunctification is associated with. The fourth issue is massification of higher education, and what I call the edufactory. So just, you know, institutions being set up just to make money, you know, like a business does, and fee-paying students, more fees, you know, building up surpluses, investing in bigger lecture halls, you know, more students. So massification being a kind of a very production line approach to higher education. Now, I think the idea that more students being at university today is a great thing. However, it's been partly driven by a business logic of increasing surpluses, right? So it's under conditions that are not ones that are particularly favorable to the future of higher education. So more students at university is a good thing. Higher education access should be available to everyone, but massification is different. It's a kind of the commercial corporate production line approach to higher education, which I call the edufactory. And this has kind of made forays into what is called ed tech, use of digitalization technologies, and online lecture, of course, which exploded with the pandemic, you know, everyone on Zoom, etc., etc. And one of the more kind of depressing cases, again, that I don't talk about in the book, I come across this only afterwards, was a professor at a university in Canada, and gave online lectures, pre-recorded, and until one of the students, and this was, I think, a art history lecture professor, very well known, until a student like Googled him to find out his contact details and posted this on Twitter. Excuse me, I just found out the prof for this online course I'm taking died in 2019. This was this year, this tweet came out. And he's technically still giving classes since he's literally my professor for this course. And I'm learning from lectures recorded before his passing. It's a great class, but what? You can understand where the shock comes from. Actually, this person who posted this tweet come across a memorial for his professor who had just seen a class on a pre-recorded lecture. But this is what I mean by this kind of massification, the edufactory, right? Okay, well, an important member of staff has died. Do we still use his lectures? Of course we do, because it's cost efficient, right? People have signed up for the course. And of course, this became a scandal in Canada, you know, regarding, you know, intellectual property rights, who owns property rights and so forth, but also just the ick factor, what I call the ick factor. It's icky, right? It's icky, as the student found out as well. A couple of more features that I think are important. Over-financialization of access relates to, obviously, the commodification of higher education. You know, this has led to the scourge, which I think is a scandal, of student debt. Now, many countries still have free access or very low fees for access to higher education, but in countries like the UK and the US, you know, which is linked to neoliberalization, high fees to gain access to higher education, taking on student debt in order to pay for that. And this is linked to neoliberalization because simply what happened is that higher education there's a change in government policy to see it as a public good that should be paid for through public taxes to a private good that should be paid for by the individual as a private asset. And if you are the only one that gained from your higher education, then you should pay for it all. It was the mentality. And of course, this has led to the big, so what would have been a public spending process has led to a personal spending process in economic terms, and a lot of debt. And I think it's currently at $1.73 trillion student debt, college debt, $1.73 trillion in the US. It's at 17 billion pounds in the UK, and these figures are just going up. They're just skyrocketing. So in the US, it's higher than auto debt, which is incredible, right? It's incredible. And of course, that adds pressure. You got to pay it off. Am I going to get a job that can pay off my debt? Some people go into retirement, after leaving university, 3-4 decades. Previously, they're going into jobs that are not enough to pay back the debt, and they'll be going into retirement with a student debt, which is, it doesn't create a good life. And I think this is a real problematic part of the neoliberal university. And finally, before I get on to my take of what's happening, is the mental health crisis. And this is important as well. So all of these things that I've talked about, which of course is a far cry from the glossy brochure, the official advertising of most universities around the world, behind the scenes, there's suffering. And this is having an impact, a psychological toll on students and staff. Mental health crisis, particularly in those countries that have really embraced the neoliberalization process. So we had the problem of suicide, which I discuss in the book, and that was a really difficult part to write about because it's so awful. It's such an awful tragedy that you can't write about this without having deep respect for the loved ones that have been lost. But some hot spots, for example, in England, some universities have hot spots where in the course of a year and a half, 13 students have taken their own life due to the pressure that they're under, but also staff have suffered from the mental health crisis sweeping higher education as well. And one of the more disturbing cases was Professor Stephen Grimm at Imperial College in London, who had a kind of a very difficult encounter with his department. I think he's a microbiologist, was told to get more funding, was under pressure to perform, and he committed suicide in 2014, but he wrote his suicide note to his department, and he put it on a delayed timer so that it was sent to them after he had passed. And this is what he said. This is what he said, and it was a long email, but this is what he said: that this is not a university anymore; it's a business with very few up in the hierarchy, like our formidable duo. Presumably, I'm not too sure who's meaning there. Presumably, upper management in his department, profiteering, and the rest of us are milk for money. Be it professors for the grant income or students who pay £100 just to extend their write-up status, etc., etc. Here it is, publish and perish. So publish or perish, of course, is the watchword for that pressure to publish. You either publish or you perish. And here he's saying publish and perish. And this is awful. Imagine receiving this on the day after one of your colleagues died from such an awful death. So it's taking its toll on people in a psychological level, and this is really kind of what I'm getting at when I use the term dark academia, the dark undertones. That of course that's not the whole university. There are happy parts, of course there is, or neutral parts, but there's this dark side that's not spoken about very much that I wanted to kind of surface and examine. Okay, so in the last part of this, I have one more dimension that I want to kind of relate to, and this is the idea that universities have to have impact and have to be relevant to business, in particular, the economy. And almost every neoliberal country and university, as a result, has to have a statement to say, how are they helping business organizations? How are they producing labor for the labor market? You know, so universities are now have to have this kind of positive influence in correcting problems in society. And I think that that's okay up to a point, but it's become very narrow, that degrees are being killed off because they do not produce labor for the economy, for example. So why have a English degree, or why have a class on Shakespearean poetry if it's not going to help the workforce get skills that they need? So that training mentality. And so also in relation to impact, you've seen some really kind of shady kind of things happen with these partnerships between universities and the business community, which in and of itself is not bad, except when it gets into things like arms manufacturing. And I explore this quite a bit in the book, where universities have really kind of sidled up and cozied up to firms like Raytheon, who are involved in creating these awful weapons, you know, that that have been involved in very controversial conflicts, like, for example, in Yemen, where the civilian casualties in the Yemen conflict with Saudi Arabia mainly, the perpetrator there, you know, the civilian casualties, children, and so forth. So you have a kind of direct link between the university knowledge production, arms manufacturing, and these horrible civil wars, and also very controversial military activity around the world. Of course, look great on the impact statement for that university. So that's where it can lead to if not checked. And of course, impact rankings, going back to metrics, are all the rage at the moment. So where does this leave me? Well, just for the last 10, 15 minutes, I just want to talk about some of the things that have really kind of been on my mind regarding what we've just discussed. Now, there's a lot of critical analysis. So these are some of the books out there looking at critiquing, like I have just now, the neoliberal university. In fact, I can think of few other professions in which its own members are so negative when they write about it in academic research. And some of the titles of these books are, you know, the zombie university, the toxic university, neoliberalism's war on higher education, and so forth, the death of the public university. So there's very strong feelings here within the community that the university as a model has gone the wrong way, and the track in which it's gone down is one that's very problematic. And some of the problems I've discussed previously, just before, are some of the main ones, the most salient ones discussed in books like this. So I want to now kind of add my contribution to what I think is occurring here as well, because I agree with everything that's been said in these books, but I think that there are some problems as well that if we get our heads around, we can even get a better understanding, if you like, a more sophisticated understanding of what's going on. So I'll just briefly go through these before making some concluding statements about dark academia. If you weren't afraid of the neoliberal university before I started this talk, I'm guessing you probably are now. But don't worry, I'm going to end the talk on a bit more of a positive note, hopefully. So one of the things that is missing in research on the neoliberal university is the role of the state. And I think one of the problems and one of the tensions, difficulties of being in academia today is that many academics point their finger at upper management, but upper management are really kind of towing the line as well of state policy, all right? So that means we have to have a more holistic view of the university. Of course, if you're a private university, for example, in the United States, or a for-profit university, there's only a few for-profit universities around the world, then that's different because they're usually quite independent. But even private universities are charities, and there's a kind of a charter that's related to state policy. But the majority of universities in places like, you know, Australia, New Zealand, the US, the UK, Scandinavia are state universities. And so a lot of this stuff is coming from politicians. And I think that's important to note, that there's a governmentality here that makes it difficult to talk about the university without also making it really big, you know, the problem big, almost too big. You know, who wants to take on the state? You know, it's just too big. And where do you start? You know, so I think the role of the state is very important to keep in mind when we're talking about what we're talking, referring to in the neoliberal university. Also the role of criticism. So one of the things I've discovered is that, you know, all of these books I talked about before, you know, these ones are all very critical of the neoliberal university, and they want us to, and so do I, of course, they want us to rediscover, you know, what, you know, authentic learning is about, you know, academic values, kind of to taper the metrics and all of the things that have gone wrong with higher education today, to avoid that. But one thing I think we really need to also understand is that still the most vocal critic of the neoliberal university are the neoliberals themselves. In other words, you know, we want to be very careful that we just not reinforce, you know, the very anti-higher education ethos that we see among neoliberal governments. And I think that's really important to note, because they're the critics, the neoliberal critics, and I call them self-hating academics. There's a lot of self-hating academics who are very critical of the university because they haven't been marketized and commercialized enough. You know, we haven't done enough to do that, and we should commercialize even more and more and more and more. And so that's an important point, I think, to keep in mind, that the most vocal critic of the neoliberal university, the one that power brokers are listening to, are the neoliberals themselves. They still don't think it's been neoliberalized enough. So we need to be very careful about how we tread on that terrain, just in case we reinforce that ethos as well in our critique. So we have to be clear about what we're for. And it's certainly not to extend neoliberalization, but to reverse it, to turn it back. And a good example of this, a big book in the United States by a Cato Institute, which is a right-wing pro-free market think tank in the United States. Brian Kaplan, who is an academic, you know, wrote this book, very popular. The politicians loved it. The Case Against Education: Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money. You know, get rid of them. They're not sensitive to market forces. They produce students that are not job ready. They're a waste of money. Academics have got it too easy. They're free riding. You know, the idea that they haven't been commercialized enough. Just totally stop public funding and let the market forces take over. And those that sink, sink, so be it. Those that swim, swim. And so this is the critique of the neoliberal university. All the politicians in the United States are listening to, right? Not the ones that we talked about before, or which the list of problems I raised before, you know, they're not listening to that, they're listening to these ideas. So this is a good example of what I mean, you know, and coming up with quotes like this, that, you know, the social dividends of education are largely illusory. In other words, what a degree adds to your ability to acquire income on the labor market, you know, it's illusory. It's illusory. All a degree tells the marketplace is that you can study and you can work on your own. Nothing to do with skills. You know, it's this kind of very cynical very anti-intellectual, extremely critical of higher education generally, that it's kind of been a waste of money, public money. So I think we've got to be very, very cognizant of the critique that's out there. The third point that's not talked about in any of the research that I'd covered across, well, kind of touched upon, but not talked about enough, is the role of complicity among academics. You know, it's a story of top-down management telling academics what to do, and they're dragged kicking and screaming into the world of the neoliberal university. We don't like it, but we have to do it. And I just don't think it happened that way. I think that what has occurred is that you know, academic agency and playing the game has been a big part of allowing this to happen. You know, we all want to get recognized by an institution. We all want to be published in the best journals. We all want career progression and promotion. And there's nothing wrong with that. But as soon as we do that within this context, we are perpetuating and reinforcing something that is problematic in terms of that neoliberalization process. And I think that the corporate university has been very cunning of attaching academic agency to these managerial frameworks, so that I only progress in my career if I'm doing it within the framework of a commercial corporate kind of ethos. You know, to the point where even an academic labor of love, you know, I love researching. I do it in the weekend. I do it when I'm not being paid. You know, I bring a lot of personal time to it, and I produce an article. Even that has been attached and quietly connected to journal rankings, to promotion, to all of these things that which we would think were quite the opposite to academic values. They've been quietly articulated together, synchronized, if you like. So I think complicity is something that hasn't been talked about enough, the role that we have played in bringing this world about. And so that hasn't been spoken about enough. You know, even resistance, even those academic resistance, which I've looked at quite a lot, tends to be very individualized, where we find our space of autonomy, and we want to be left alone. You know, it's very, very much part of how the neoliberalization process works. What it doesn't like is collectivism. It doesn't like when academics get together and start forming collective groups. It doesn't like that. It likes isolation. You know, you just work on your article and, you know, make sure you hit the top journals. And if it's because of your labor of love, we don't care. Just as long as you hit the targets, that's the main thing that matters. So even academic resistance, when it's individualized in that way, can reinforce and reproduce the very thing that we're trying to escape, which means that resistance is very tricky. It's something I've looked at quite a lot, about why academic resistance to neoliberalization has been so ineffective. It's been a very, very lamentable situation in which, you know, academics are generally quite conservative. They were good students at high school. They were good students at university. They're good men and women as employees. They tend not to be kind of raucous or anything like that. It's not like like a proletariat kind of mentality, but also just have been very bad at collectivizing, unionism and so forth. That tends to be the way in which the best resistance works. So, and another element of that, I think, from the pandemic, and this is a product of the pandemic, is what I've called the financialization of academic consciousness, in which we are now all thinking like the CFO of a big institution. We've taken on this accountant mentality, and we see the world purely as numbers. And I think that's been a big impact of the pandemic. This is a quote from a report in the UK by PwC, the large consultancy company who interviewed CFOs in large universities in that country and asked them, what is a good thing about the pandemic? You'd think that's quite a strange thing to ask, given the suffering, widespread suffering it's caused. But these are some of the responses. And one of the big responses is, well, everyday academics are now thinking like financial consultants. Are there enough students? How can we save costs? How can we create efficiencies? And I think that's another reason why there's been a bit of complicity in this process. The other thing, there's just a couple more before I'm going to summarize. Students are missing in most critiques of the university. And I think students are very, very important. Students are seen to be, now the kind of the neoliberalization of the universities turned students into customers. But, I think the reluctant customers and many critiques of the neoliberal university are too dismissive of students. And I think a reconnection with students, where it's study, whether you're a professor or whether you're an undergraduate student, we study, and that's our shared ethos, and there is a bond and there's a solidarity there. And that solidarity has been obliterated by the structures of the neoliberal university, but I think we need to recover that solidarity. I think that's really important. The point that I raised earlier was neoliberalism itself as a concept. And I don't think most universities that are called neoliberal are neoliberal. So I think we need to come up with a different terminology. And what I mean by that is that, that most universities are still public institutions reliant on the state and the taxpayers for income and for subsidies. They're large bureaucracies. They tend to try and avoid competition, and the ethos within is these institutions are very different to a large corporation. So the idea of a neoliberalism from, say, the Chicago School of Economics, these kind of like agile kind of, free market organizations, I don't think universities, even though they've been told to mimic business corporations, they don't quite function like that. So I think we need to come up with a different set of terminologies to describe what's occurring here. That's just a point that's kind of been sitting in the back of my mind as I read a lot of this material and try to figure out what I think is going on. So I would just like to draw some conclusions after this after that chat. And I've been going for about an hour or so. So just some conclusions before I finish off. I hope you're not too afraid of the neoliberal university, because fear is not a good way to resist. Fear is losing half of the battle. So hence my title, I think, regarding how we might rethink the modern university and modern pedagogy and so forth. And I have to reiterate, as I said in my opening statement, I'm a huge fan of higher education. The reason I've decided to look at this stuff and give my contribution to what's happening is because I still think there is something to save. Yeah. So otherwise I wouldn't have bothered. Why write a book and do all of this if you don't still have some hope that you know what you want as an alternative? And that, I think, is something that's very similar among many academics who are struggling with what's occurring in the occupation and the profession that we've chosen. So what is to be done? What is to be done? And so where to from here? I end the book on a very pessimistic note, I have to warn you, if you get a chance to have a look at it, in the sense that I ask that old Kantian question of, is hope permissible? And it's a brilliant question, because hope can be very misleading. Sometimes a situation is hopeless. And the best thing to do in that situation is to face up to it, rather than to engage in self-deception. I think that's the case in any walk of life. So one has to be very honest about whether the hope is rational or not. Also the publisher. In most critical analyses of anything, the last chapter is always the happy chapter about, and these are the alternatives. You cannot be critical without positing an alternative. And I didn't really want to do that. It just felt, the optimism just felt a little bit cheap. Cheap optimism is worse than pessimism, I think. Again, going back to the idea of whether hope is permissible. So hence I say, what can be done, if anything? Isn't the lost cause completely lost? And so I don't want to end on that note today. That's kind of the note I end on in the book. I published the book 6 months ago, and I've been pressed by interviewers and so forth about, if you actually did write this book because you still thought something was fighting for, then what is it? What is it? And I think that study is really important. I'm a big fan of study. And study has an element of amateurism, unprofessionalized study. That some of the greatest inventions in the movement of civilization occurred, outside of the university. And some of the greatest inventions in the university occurred because of study and this amateurist interest, intrinsic. The person that invented penicillin didn't do it because there was a target or a KPI, or because they wanted to publish in this journal, or polio vaccination. They didn't do it because they wanted to publish in the best journal and were thinking about their career. There was an amateurism, but there was a purpose. There was a public purpose. Don't get me wrong. It was solving a problem and it was out there, but they did not do it for the reasons that the university today thinks we research and thinks we publish papers and thinks we try and be good teachers. Very alien to that amateurism that I think is really, really important. So study is key. But I'll just go very briefly through reclaiming the academic means of production. We are the means of production. And this one thing that I think is really important, that given that we're highly trained cognitive workers, we are, our bodies and our minds, of course, are the means of production, using that old Marxian term of seizing, the means of production when Marx was writing were the factory machines, right? But we are the machines now. And we own ourselves, we're not slaves. And our employer doesn't own us. And so the means of production has to be re-seized, and we are them. And I think that's important. I think the public university has definitely lost its mission, by and large. And what it's there for, why have a university? What is its purpose? Is it just to make more income? Is it to churn out degrees? Is it to feed the labor market? Is it to, what is the reason for the university? I think we need to rethink what that mission is, and it has to be a very social mission. Democratic university. And I do not mean democracy in a utopian sense, but I think that when it comes to how we manage our institution, if we are the means of production, how do we manage ourselves as knowledge creators and as teachers? And I don't think this top-down approach works. Well, it clearly doesn't. It serves a certain purpose, but it just annoys everyone. When we are when an academic is the world-renowned expert on their given topic, and is charged with a whole bunch of professional autonomy to deliver research that is making a difference in their chosen field and great classes, then a top-down management approach like you have in a factory just doesn't work. It doesn't work. It just causes discontent. So I think we need to rethink about how those kind of structures of coordination are arranged in these very idiosyncratic institutions, which are really highly trained, independent, professional organizations based around knowledge creation, which cannot be measured in a very easy way with numbers. It cannot be captured through the metrics that are used in saturating universities today. We have to rethink, I think, that management. It has to be self-management and it has to be participatory. Students and free education are very key, I think, way forward. That university's always been financialized. There's always been a money, sum associated with running a university. They don't come out of thin air. Someone has to pay for it. But I think they've been over-financialized in all sorts of ways, and that we need the free universitat is a very important ideal as a public good that we can move forward with. Otherwise it becomes, the richest person gets access, and that leads to a class-based system. Inequality is a huge problem, and it goes on and on and on. I think, equal opportunity, equal access has to be a key ideal. And what type of university do we want in the community? And I think that a university has to have reach. So rather than the word impact, the term reach, I think, is very important. And obviously it can't be a cloistered institution that has no relationship to the outside world. But again, but the opposite of that isn't this kind of high impact institution that we see all around us today, where it's, how are you adding value to business? How are you actually creating work-worthy job graduates? That real instrumental approach. It has, instead of that instrumental approach, we have to have reach and influence. The good university, certainly not involved in the military or the production of arms. And the healthy university, finally, the healthy university is one in which we don't suffer within. And going back to that mental health crisis that I mentioned, which again, if you talk to people not within higher education, they're shocked when they look at the levels of mental health problems that is kind of cascaded through higher education in the neoliberal world over the last 15 years. They're shocked because they still think that it's a cozy, easy, enjoyable, relaxed occupation. There's that mentality out there, which is completely at odds with what's going on the ground. So a healthy university is one in which we flourish rather than suffer. And I think that's an important ideal towards which we should be aiming. But of course, the academic university as well, going back to the problem of study. But of course, just to finish off with, or is it too late? I couldn't help but get that tone of pessimism in there. It seems to me that in countries that are really well advanced in this process, 30 years of neoliberalization, places like New Zealand, the UK, the US, obviously, is it too late? Because all of this list of criteria that I've given here are just so far away, so remote from what is present today that, is it unrealistic when it comes to bridging that gap between the present situation and, the university that we would like to have? Is it too much to ask, or is it too late? And do we have to simply try and start again with something else? And I'm not too sure I've got an answer to that question, but I think it's important to keep in mind so that we face the issue with honesty, going back to that idea of facing up to the truth, and not falling for that trope of cheap optimism. I call it cheap optimism. Let's be optimistic. There's still hope, and we can do this. I think we need to be very realistic. On that note, I would like to thank you for your patience with me working through these ideas, and thank you very much for being here and sharing this talk. Thank you for also again to the university for inviting me to give this webinar. The topic is quite grim, and the book is quite grim, but I think it's a story that needs to be told. It's not the whole story, of course, that's important to keep in mind, but it's a story that hasn't been told as much as I think we need to speak about it. I really hope you enjoyed that. Well, enjoy, it's maybe not the right word, but you know what I mean. And thank you very much for listening. Cheers.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Fleming, for a very illuminating presentation. Though I have to admit that some part of your presentation makes me feel powerless with the pervasiveness of neoliberalism. And many things you mentioned are actually quite familiar in Indonesian context. So as I listen to your presentation, I feel like seeing myself in the mirror. So we already have 15 questions here, but I think due to the time constraint, maybe we are not able to address all questions. So I'm just going to read some of the questions for you. The first question is coming from Kurniawan Saifullah. So the question is that how should university, and I think he's referring to the universities in the global south, which is currently struggling to reach the so-called world-class university standard. So how would you comment on that, considering the imbalanced power relation between the global south and global north universities?
Shall I answer that now, or yeah?
Yes, please. I think it's better for you. Do you want me to read all the questions first? And
no,
then
that's fine. Yeah, no, we can do them one at a time. I think that's a great question. And you're exactly right. You're exactly right that I think that the North and South divide when it comes to these world rankings are is so obvious. And it's so obvious that the world rankings have been designed in a way to promote the richer countries and to land on top. I would suggest, thinking about an alternative way of dealing with education rather than competing on a competing in a system that could be rigged right from the start. Yeah, it could be rigged in favor of the Oxbridge and the Ivy League and the the bigger universities in other countries. It could be rigged to always have them on top. So I think that the danger with competing again in that system is that it's going to always reflect those biases. So I would suggest struggling, do your own thing. Rather than look to this global system, do your own thing and specialize and make something special. Make something special within your own context would be one way. Now that doesn't mean to become insular and to forget about the world. Nothing like that. We live in a globalized world, but to kind of really focus on doing what you do well first, rather than trying to do well against these rankings, which I think are really problematic.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Fleming. And the second question comes from Doni Kurniawan. So he's asking which university can be a role model which has a good environment in research, education, teaching, and community service without getting stuck in capitalism. Or maybe if there are no universities model at the moment, perhaps what kind of imaginary universities can we have in order to be able to resist to this language of neoliberalism?
That's a good question as well. Well, one thing I try not to do, and I think I've avoided it, and I avoided it in my talk, was to kind of name universities and say this was a bad one, but this one's an okay one, which I'm not really interested in. All universities have good parts and bad parts, I think. So, however. And I think the same goes for the good universities that I've encountered. I've been lucky to work in a university that's a wonderful space. It's a wonderful space. Obviously, all universities have problems, But yeah, I think rather than point at universities that are better than the others, which gets us into that ranking system, you know, we either come up with an alternative ranking that measures the things that I measured, you know, is it healthy? Is it good? Does it have a public mission? Is it free? And we would not find that university in many places around the world, I wouldn't think. Maybe Scandinavia, which I've had the great fortune to give some classes in Scandinavian countries as well. But, you know, I think rather than point out universities that are good, you know, to come up with a composite would be one way forward. You know, this is good in this university, this is good in this university, this is good in this university. What would it look like? And could it survive? Could it survive in a capitalist society or a neoliberal capitalist society? Now, that's important. The other important thing to keep in mind, that so a composite would be the way I would push forward. But also remember, neoliberal capitalism is the dominant discourse within within a society that has many different discourses. I'm not a pluralist. It's the dominant one. It's 80% of what we do. But there is a 10% non-capitalist thing that we do, you know, our family, for example, our religion. So there are spaces. There are spaces. And I think those spaces are interesting to keep hold of, and to think about the university as one of those spaces, perhaps, if we wanted to build our composite ideal good university.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Fleming. And we have another question. And I think you mentioned earlier about the role of the state in resisting neoliberalism. But the issue here is, as a raised question by Ahmad Bukhari, as academic, what can we do to best navigate neoliberalism in higher education determined by the government? Because many states themselves are adopting neoliberal values at the moment. So how can we navigate our role as in higher education?
It's another great question, and one of the reasons I raised that, you know, I've talked to vice chancellors in many universities, and they don't like the neoliberal university either, right? Obviously they're kind of agents of it to a certain extent, but they're kind of getting orders from above them, and particular public ones. So I think that we need to widen the way in which we think of the politics of the university, rather than thinking of it as a private enterprise in which you have owners, you know, managers at the apex of the organization and those at the bottom fighting each other. You know, we need to widen the scope of our political understanding, and that means entering into the political domain. You know, the political domain, influencing politicians. One thing that's interesting in this regard is that, and I'm thinking mainly of the US situation, and I'm not too sure what it's like in the other countries, but think tanks and intellectuals have been very, very influential in the way in which politicians have thought about higher education, in the way that has led to the mess that we've got today. So creating counter narratives, I think, is important for politicians to read, and to put it on the political, put it on the table for elections and for local elections, and for what we want from our government. You know, we want from our governments, obviously a zone of study and intellectual activity that is not going to hurt people. So yeah, but it's a good question. It makes resisting neoliberalism unwieldy, because it's not just our own institution, it's the sector, but also the polity, a governmentality, the state apparatus. But I don't think that should be completely leading to resignation. But it's a good point.
I mean, there is this one interesting question. So the person would like to know, what sort of critical pedagogy do you practice when teaching business school students? Do you see this as an opportunity to challenge neoliberalism? So if you could share your best practices, probably in teaching students to be critical in resisting to the whole language of neoliberalism, particularly in business school students.
No. So business schools are interesting. So, obviously, the neoliberal agenda has influenced the business school, but it's influenced, law departments. It's influenced the humanities, the sciences that now see themselves as entrepreneurs and startups and so forth. So I've really just approached my teaching of business school students. I'm lucky, I guess, because I teach in a university that's got a business school that's very social justice orientated. So in order for our graduates to understand business, it also, to be good at business, it also really means about what is business and what are its impacts and what are some of the dynamics that it can create regarding a social justice perspective. So I guess I'm lucky that I teach in that kind of environment. I teach a course called the Socio-Political Context of Management, which is a lot of fun. Students are really, really interested in critical views of the society in which they're in. They know what's going wrong with the world we live in, and they're worried about it as much as anyone else, and providing tools for them to navigate those issues and those political problems, they really, really enjoy it, and they get a lot out of it. So, it's because we think of a business school as a cliche producing corporate robots. Yep, but most good business schools are not really like that.
Thank you. There are actually a couple of questions asking about accreditation. Here, the language of accreditation in Indonesia is quite powerful. And I think many people, when they're talking about accreditation, they are relating with the notion of quality. So I think the question is trying to ask, can we have another definition of quality that doesn't necessarily mean we are conforming to certain standards? So I'm sort of like refreshing the question. My apologies here.
Yeah, no, that's a good accreditation. It's interesting, These accreditation bodies have really grown in power, quite amazingly so, and it's connected to everything that we've been talking about today. They've become kind of, if you do not get your accreditation, then you're seen to be substandard, which is ludicrous, right? Because of the power relationship that's obviously important there. Now, quality is important. Let's definitely agree on that. But accreditation seems to be a box-ticking exercise that institutions now need to do in order to be seen as legitimate to students and prospective staff and so forth. And I think accreditation has gone a bit too far in some ways, because it's almost like a middleman process, a middleman process of, if you don't get the accreditation, we stand between you and your star, and we'll give you your star if you do all of these things. So I think, I think that thinking about quality outside of accreditation and rankings, does it kill creativity? It's, accreditation and rankings have been around, for a long time. Their staunch quantification and excessive reliance of everything we do on those accreditations and rankings, yes, does kill creativity. I'm sure of it. And of course, creativity is at the center of what we do. And I think that's why there is such a forlornness within the neoliberal university today, is because, the environment, the dominant environment in which we operate within, is antithetical to what we know is good academic work.
And I think we can have one more question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I think there is this one question from Virgie, and she's asking, can neoliberalism harmonize with social policy, or is it always perceived as the opposite of?
So by social policy, it's a very broad term. So can neoliberalism harmonize with what type of social policy, I guess? Yeah, I'm not too sure about that question. Maybe, would you like to try another question?
Okay, sure. I think there is this one interesting question. It says, it asks, currently universities in Indonesia, we are facing several issues such as intolerance, radicalism, terrorism, bullying, and also corruption. Could it be the result of neoliberalism? I think this is quite a big question as well.
So a spreading of intolerance, bullying, etc., corruption, and universities in Indonesia, do you think it's related to neoliberalism? I would need to know a little bit more about that, but you know, first of all, I don't think we can blame everything on neoliberalism. I think there's a tendency to see neoliberalism among critics of this policy as the root of all ills in the world. Now it's the root of many of them, but I don't think they're all leading to. I don't think the cause of all of the ills of the world, like you know, bullying, perhaps, definitely. Corruption, I'm not too sure. Corruption I've studied corruption quite extensively in previous research, and that's complex. It's related to informal economies and so forth. Yeah, so I think my answer to that question would be, we should be very precise and very careful about what we say as a problematic effect of neoliberalism. It can be too easy just to say, well, that's neoliberalism. Oh, that's bad, that's neoliberalism. I think we need to be quite crisp and precise. Otherwise, it's too easy to dismiss it when you've got something really valid to say around neoliberalism.
Maybe the person is asking because with the emphasis on economic, then the social justice issues become overlooked in education setting.
Yeah, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Yep, yeah, definitely then. Yeah, definitely. Is neoliberalism kind of a dominant process in Indonesia at the moment?
I think universities are moving toward privatization, and also pressure for metric, I think, is all over the place at the moment. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So we have couple more questions. Would you like to choose which one you would like to answer, Professor Fleming, instead of me selecting for you?
Yeah. So so what about which rector is elected? Do you think in the future the university will perish? So by AD, yeah. Society finds knowledge on the internet, and employers do not need graduates but skilled employees. That's a good question. It's a good question. You know, those trends, I think, have certainly challenged the that you've mentioned there. Challenged the bedrock legitimacy or the sureties or certainties that universities have held on to for many years, that you'll always need a university because a degree leads to a good job. And universities aren't necessarily training institutes. So when it comes to training skills, maybe in vocational law, for example, would be an example, maybe medical school for medicine, but many of the departments and, the social sciences would be an example. You don't see a one-to-one connection between what a student learns and, what they put into practice. So that could actually create uncertainties for the future of the university. So what about finds knowledge on the internet? Maybe. I think there's been a resurgence of amateurism where you've got podcasts, alternative news, not fake news, but alternative news and alternative journalism. It's been very kind of academic orientated. That's been important. But I think that when it comes to studying, and research where you need someone to be employed to do it rather than as purely as a hobby, then the institution of the university will be a place where that is probably going to be still required in the future, rather than it just being found on the internet. I think you're still going to need that space and time for intellectual activity and research. And so will it perish in the future because of the reasons that you pointed out there? You know, certain critics from the right-wing side, the neoliberals, would like it to, as I mentioned earlier, but I think we've got to hold on to the idea of, first of all, the knowledge you find on the internet is not going to be as robust as you will get from someone who spends several years researching the nature of a biological process, for example. And also, if we give up on the idea that universities are training institutions only, but they're more than that. They're more than just providing skills to the labor market. They're doing something else. Their mandate is partly that, but it's not just that, and it's not a dominant part of what the university is. Then if we think about, if we agree with that, then I think the university will still be around for a while.
Thank you very much, Professor Fleming. There are still a couple of questions, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. So once again, thank you very much for this very inspiring lecture. Some of the topics discussed make us feel powerless with the pervasiveness of neoliberalism, but I really like your taken home message, which is we are all part of the universities. And I think the fact that we are critical with the role of higher education is because we still have hope. And I think that's a very powerful message that can be taken from your lecture. And it reminds me of what Foucault mentioned before, that, you know, we are all questioning power, not because it's not true, but rather because we are questioning the contingency of power. So I think thank you very much. And I think this is such an important topic. I hope we can invite you one day in person, that many things have to be discussed, probably, and especially since the language of neoliberalism is very powerful in the South and also in the North. So once again, thank you very much. And we give you a big round of applause for.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and the questions are wonderful. They're the ones I'm asking myself as well, and I've really enjoyed chatting about this topic, and thank you very much again for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Hopefully we can invite you in person in the years to come.
I would love that.
Thank you. So now I'm going to hand it over again to Pak Ubad, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ibu Vina. Ladies and gentlemen, let's once again give a big round of applause for both Professor Fleming and also Ibu Vina for such an informative presentation as well as insightful discussion. Professor Fleming, as a token of appreciation from the organizing committee, there will be a certificate handed to you, which will be virtually presented by the Directorate of International Affairs, Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, Bapak Ahmad Bukhari Muslim, please.
Thank you, Pak Ubad. Professor Peter Fleming, on behalf of Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, I would like to extend our highest appreciations for your very inspiring and also reflective presentations on the issue of neoliberalism in our educations. We do hope, as the moderator said, we can invite you in person to our university in the future when the pandemic is going away. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And the second certificate will be virtually handed again by the Directorate of International Affairs to our lovely moderator for today, Ibu Vina Adriani, PhD. Oh, so it is actually not virtually handed, but
Thank you, Ibu Vina.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the certificate presentation to both the speaker and the moderator marks at the closing of today's webinar. But before I officially close today's webinar, I would like to announce you several things. First, we still have 2 upcoming webinars. The nearest one will be on November 22nd, and the topic of discussion will be about SDG 7, Universal Access to Modern Clean Energy, delivered by Professor John Lovett from School of Geography, University of Leeds, UK, whose expertise in on natural resource management. You can scan the QR code and for registration links. And the second one is, or the last one is going to be on November 26, 2021. And the topic of the discussion will be on multi-representation in science education, delivered by Professor David Trigast from School of Education, Curtin University, Australia. For further details of each of the webinar series, you can find on DIA UP Instagram account at dia.up, at dia.upi. There will be any information needed, including the registration links for both the webinar series. So ladies and gentlemen, it's time to part ways. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to once again thank you. I would like to once again express my most sincere gratitude for your enthusiastic participation, especially for all those great questions. So once again, let's give a big round of applause to all of you. And also my apologies for any inconvenience. So I am Ubat, your master of ceremony for today's event, signing off. Please stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy. Bye-bye. See you on the next webinar. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Have a great day, everybody.